a warm, clear summer afternoon on the 31st of July, 2015. An experienced pilot brought a small business jet in to land at a quiet airfield in the south of England. The weather was perfect. The visibility was excellent. The aircraft was in good working order, with no technical faults of any kind. And the pilot was no novice. He had 11,000 hours of flying experience, more than 1,000 of them in this very type of aircraft, and he had landed at this same airfield before. By every conventional measure, this should have been one of the most routine landings imaginable. And yet, in the final minute of the flight, this capable pilot flew his aircraft across the runway threshold more than 40 knots too fast, touched down 2/3 of the way along a runway that was already short, and ran out of tarmac with catastrophic speed still on the aircraft. He never abandoned the landing. He never went around. He pressed on toward a runway he could not possibly stop on, as though the option of climbing away and trying again had simply ceased to exist in his mind. All 4 people aboard survived the impact and then died in the fire that followed. This is the story of the Black Bushy crash, and of one of the most important and unsettling phenomena in all of human performance. The way a capable mind, overwhelmed by too much at once, can narrow to a single fatal point of focus and lose the ability to see the way out. This is the story of tunnel vision. On the 31st of July, 2015, an Embraer Phenom 300, a small modern business jet, crashed while attempting to land at Black Bushy Airport, a general aviation airfield in Hampshire, in the south of England. The aircraft was arriving from Milan in Italy, carrying a single pilot and 3 passengers. It approached the airfield in fine weather, entered the landing circuit, and then, in the space of a few minutes, everything unraveled. The jet came in far too fast and too high, crossed the runway threshold at a speed dramatically greater than it should have, floated down the runway, and touched down with only a fraction of the landing distance remaining. It could not stop. It overran the end of the runway, struck an earthen bank, briefly became airborne again, and came to rest in the car park of a vehicle auction site, directly adjacent to the airfield, where it caught fire almost instantly. All 4 people on board, the pilot and 3 passengers, survived the crash itself, but were killed by the intense fire that engulfed the wreckage. No one on the ground was hurt. The subsequent investigation by the United Kingdom's Air Accidents Investigation Branch found no mechanical defect, no adverse weather, and no impairment in the pilot. What it found instead was something far more human, and in a way far more frightening. A capable pilot who, overwhelmed by a rapid accumulation of demands and warnings in the final minutes of the flight, became fixated on continuing the approach. His mental capacity saturated, his ability to step back and reconsider simply gone. This is the story of how that happened, and of the psychology of fixation that lies at its heart. To understand this accident, we must understand that its cause lies not in metal or machinery, but in the mind, in the limits of human attention under pressure. But first, the aircraft, the people, and the airfield. The aircraft was an Embraer Phenom 300, a light business jet of a popular and well-regarded modern design. It is a compact aircraft, seating a handful of passengers, with 2 engines mounted at the rear of the fuselage. A fast, capable, single-pilot certified jet of the kind used widely in private and corporate aviation. This particular Phenom 300 had been built in 2010 and was in good condition. The investigation would find no pre-existing technical defect of any kind. It was registered in Saudi Arabia and owned by a private aviation company. On the day of the accident, it was making a straightforward flight from Milan to Black Bushy, the sort of short international hop that business jets make routinely. There was nothing about the aircraft itself that contributed to the disaster. It did exactly what it was asked to do, which, on this day, was the problem. Aboard were 4 people, the pilot and 3 passengers. Out of respect for the privacy of the deceased and their family, we will focus here on the facts relevant to the accident rather than on the identities of those aboard. It is enough to say that the 3 passengers were members of a prominent family, traveling privately, and that they, like the pilot, lost their lives in the fire. What matters most for understanding the accident is the pilot, because it is in his experience and in what happened to his mind in the final minutes that the lessons of this tragedy reside. And here we encounter the first and perhaps most important fact of the whole case. The pilot was highly experienced. He was in his late 50s and he had accumulated around 11,000 hours of flying time over his career, a very substantial total, including well over 1,000 hours specifically on the Phenom 300. He had previously flown large airliners. He had flown into Blackbushy before and was familiar with it. This was not a green, inexperienced aviator in over his head. This was a seasoned professional, and that fact is central to everything that follows. Because the tragedy of Blackbushy is precisely that it can happen to anyone. The phenomenon that brought this aircraft down does not respect experience. It is a feature of how the human mind itself works. Under the wrong conditions, and it can reach out and seize even the most capable among us. The airfield was Blackbushy, a general aviation airport with a single runway of modest length. It is a perfectly ordinary and safe airfield for an aircraft like the Phenom 300, provided that aircraft arrives in a stable, controlled state at the correct speed and touches down in the correct place. But a short runway is, by its nature, less forgiving of error than a long one. On a 2-mile runway at a major airport, an aircraft that comes in too fast and lands too far along has a great deal of margin to recover or to abandon the landing. On a shorter runway, that margin shrinks dramatically. Every knot of excess speed, every extra 100 meters floated past the ideal touchdown point, eats into a reserve that was never large to begin with. Blackbush demanded precision, the precision of a stabilized approach flown at the right speed to the right spot. What it received that afternoon was an aircraft arriving in almost exactly the opposite state. Too high, too fast, and getting worse. Before we follow the aircraft down, we need to understand the two concepts at the heart of this disaster: the psychology of fixation and the discipline of the go-around. Together, they explain both why the pilot did what he did and why he had every opportunity not to. Begin with fixation, sometimes called tunnel vision, or in more technical language, attentional or cognitive saturation. The human mind, for all its power, has a finite capacity to process information and manage tasks at any given moment. Under normal conditions, a skilled pilot handles the many simultaneous demands of flying with ease, moving fluidly between tasks, monitoring instruments, and adjusting to new information. But when the demands pile up too quickly, when too many things happen at once, each requiring attention, each adding to the load, that finite capacity can become saturated. And when the mind is saturated, something dangerous happens. Rather than shedding tasks in an orderly way, or stepping back to reassess the whole situation, the overwhelmed mind tends to narrow. It locks onto one goal, often the most immediate and concrete one, and pours its remaining resources into that single objective, while its ability to take in new information, to update its understanding of the situation, and to consider alternatives progressively shuts down. This is fixation. The pilot experiencing it is not being careless or lazy. On the contrary, he is often working furiously hard, but on the wrong thing, unable to lift his gaze from the narrow tunnel his attention has collapsed into. He has, in a very real sense, lost access to part of his own mind, the part that could have told him to stop. The critical feature of fixation, the one that makes it so lethal, is what it does to the mental model. Every pilot carries in their head a mental model of their situation, an internal picture of where the aircraft is, what it's doing, what's coming next, and what the plan is. Good flying depends on continuously updating that model as new information arrives, and on changing the plan when the model shows the current plan isn't working. Fixation attacks precisely this process. The saturated, fixated mind clings to its existing model and its existing plan. I am landing on this runway, and becomes unable to absorb the mounting evidence that the plan has become unviable. Warning sound. Parameters go out of limits. The runway looms in the wrong place at the wrong speed, and none of it penetrates, because the part of the mind that would take it in and act on it is overwhelmed and locked. The plan continues, not because the pilot has weighed it and chosen it, but because he has lost the capacity to reconsider it. This is why fixing is so insidious. It disables the very mental machinery whose job is to catch and correct the error. And this is where the second concept comes in, the go-around, the discipline that exists precisely to be the escape hatch from a bad approach. As we have discussed in other cases, aviation has a formal concept of the stabilized approach. An aircraft should arrive on the correct path, at the correct speed, in the correct configuration, and if it is not stabilized by a certain point, the correct response is to abandon the approach, add power, climb away, and try again. The go-around is a routine, safe, always available maneuver. At any point in the approach into Black Bushy, as the speed built up, as the aircraft got high, as the warnings began to sound, as the runway threshold approached far too fast, the pilot could have gone around. A go-around would have cost nothing but a few minutes and taken the aircraft safely back into the sky to set up a fresh, stable approach. It was the obvious, trained, correct response to the situation the aircraft was in. But the go-around requires something that fixation destroys. It requires the pilot to recognize that the approach has gone bad and to make the decision to abandon it. A fixated mind, locked on to continue the landing, cannot make that recognition. The escape hatch was there, unlocked, the whole time. The tragedy is that the pilot, in his saturated state, could no longer see it. Now we can follow the final minutes and see the trap close. As the Phenom approached Blackbush in fine weather, it entered the airfield's landing circuit, the standard rectangular pattern flown to line up with the runway, and here the demands began to accumulate. While in the circuit, the pilot received a warning from the aircraft's collision avoidance system, alerting him to the presence of another, much smaller aircraft, a microlight, also flying in the vicinity of the airfield. This was a legitimate call on his attention. Another aircraft nearby is something a pilot must take seriously. He maneuvered in response, but the maneuvering and the distraction came at a cost. It left the Phenom in a poor position to land, higher and faster than it should have been for this stage of the approach. The aircraft was now behind, energetically speaking, carrying too much height and too much speed, needing to lose both quickly to make a safe landing. The workload was climbing, the situation was deteriorating, and the clock was running. Then came the cascade that would saturate the pilot's mind. As the Phenom pressed on toward the runway, too high and too fast, its terrain awareness and warning system began to sound, and not just once. 6 times during the final approach, the system issued urgent pull-up warnings, its automated voice commanding the pilot to climb, because the aircraft's steep, fast descent toward the ground was triggering its safety logic. 6 times. Each warning was a demand on the pilot's attention, a loud, insistent alarm requiring interpretation and response, piling onto an already overloaded mind that was simultaneously trying to manage an aircraft that was too fast, too high, and running out of room. This is the very picture of cognitive saturation. Warning upon warning upon warning, each one adding to the load, none of them able to break through and produce the one response that would have saved everyone, a go-around. Instead of triggering escape, the barrage of alarms appears to have done the opposite. It overwhelmed, it saturated, it narrowed the tunnel further. The pilot flew on, fixated, toward the runway. The numbers tell the story of just how bad the approach had become. As the Phenom crossed the runway threshold, the point by which it should have been slow and stable, and ready to touch down almost immediately, it was traveling at about 151 knots, some 43 knots faster than its target threshold speed of around 108 knots. This is an enormous excess. The aircraft was screaming across the threshold far too fast to land in the distance available, and so it did what a too fast aircraft does. It floated, refusing to settle onto the runway, eating up precious tarmac while the pilot waited for it to touch down. When the wheels finally met the runway, the aircraft had used up 2/3 of the available length, leaving only around 440 meters in which to stop, and it was still traveling at around 134 knots, a speed at which it would have needed far more than that remaining distance to come to a halt. The physics were now inescapable. The aircraft simply could not stop in the runway that remained. What had begun as an unstable approach had become, by the moment of touchdown, an unsurvivable geometry. What followed was swift and merciless. The Phenom ran off the end of the runway at high speed, still carrying far too much velocity to stop. It struck an earthen bank at the airfield boundary, which launched it briefly back into the air, and it came down in the car park of a vehicle auction facility immediately adjacent to the airfield, crowded with parked cars. The impact was survivable. Remarkably, all 4 people aboard lived through the crash itself. But almost immediately, within roughly a second of the aircraft coming to rest, fire broke out, fed by the fuel, and fanned into an intense blaze that spread to the surrounding vehicles. And here the tragedy reached its cruel conclusion. The 4 occupants, having survived the impact, were unable to escape the fire. It is a detail almost too painful to record that the passengers appear to have attempted to open the cabin door and were unable to get out in time. All 4 died, not from the crash, but from the fire that followed it. No one on the ground was harmed. When the Air Accidents Investigation Branch investigated the crash, they proceeded, as investigators do, by systematically ruling out possibilities. Was there a mechanical fault, an engine problem, a brake failure, a flight control malfunction that could explain the aircraft's inability to stop or the pilot's failure to go around? They examined the wreckage thoroughly and found none. The Phenom had been in sound working order. Was the weather a factor? Wind, poor visibility, a slippery runway? No, conditions were fine, warm and clear with good visibility and gentle winds. Was the pilot impaired in some way, by a medical event, by fatigue, by any substance? The investigation found no evidence of impairment. One by one, the conventional explanations fell away, and what remained was the mind. The aircraft had been perfectly capable of landing safely or going around. The conditions had permitted it. The pilot had been physically and medically able to do it. And yet the approach had been flown, unstably and far too fast, all the way into the ground. The explanation had to lie in what had happened inside the cockpit, inside the pilot's head, in those final overloaded minutes. The conclusion the investigators reached is worth stating carefully, because it is the crux of the entire case. They determined that several factors had combined to create a very high workload for the pilot, and that this workload may have saturated his mental capacity, impeding his ability to handle new information and to adapt his mental model, leading him to become fixated on continuing the approach. Read that again, because every phrase carries weight. Several factors combined. It was not one thing but the accumulation of many. The traffic warning, the maneuvering, the high and fast energy state, the repeated terrain warnings piling up together. A very high workload. The demands exceeded what could be comfortably managed, saturated his mental capacity. The load exceeded the mind's processing limit, impeding his ability to handle new information and adapt his mental model. He could no longer take in what was happening and change his plan accordingly, leading him to become fixated on continuing the approach. And so, locked onto the goal of landing, he flew a doomed approach to its conclusion. This is not a story of a bad pilot. It is a story of a human mind pushed past its limits, and of what happens to any human mind when it is. This phenomenon has a long and sobering history in aviation, and Blackbushy is only its most recent chapter. Some of the most famous accidents in the history of flight have turned on exactly this kind of fixation. In one legendary case decades ago, an entire crew of a large airliner became so absorbed in diagnosing a minor problem with a landing gear indicator light, a burned-out bulb, as it turned out, that no one noticed the autopilot had disengaged and the aircraft was slowly descending into the ground until it was too late. 3 highly trained crew members, all fixated on a trivial fault, flew a perfectly good airliner into the terrain because their collective attention had tunneled onto the wrong thing. The details differ from Blackbushy, but the underlying mechanism is identical. Attention captured and narrowed, the big picture lost, the fatal development unfolding just outside the tunnel of focus. That this same failure mode recurs across the decades, across different aircraft, different crews, and different circumstances, is powerful evidence that it is not about any individual's shortcomings, but about something structural in how human attention works. The mind is a spotlight, not a floodlight. It illuminates brilliantly what it points at, and leaves the rest in darkness. And under overload, that spotlight can lock in place. There is a related phenomenon that likely played its part at Blackbushy, the startle effect. When a person is suddenly confronted with an unexpected, alarming stimulus, a blaring warning, a sudden threat, there is a brief but significant period during which cognitive performance actually degrades, as the mind reels and reorients. A single startle can cost precious seconds of clear thinking. Now imagine startle upon startle, a traffic alert, then a pull-up, then another and another, 6 times over, each one a fresh jolt to a mind already struggling to keep up. Rather than allowing the pilot time to recover his composure and reassess, the relentless succession of alarms may have kept him in a perpetual state of startled reaction, never able to climb back out of the hole, his higher reasoning. The part that could have said this isn't working, go around, swamped again and again before it could assert itself. The barrage did not just add workload, It may have actively disrupted the pilot's capacity to think clearly at the very moment he most needed to. It is worth dwelling on why experience offers so little protection against this particular failure, because it is one of the most counterintuitive and important lessons of the case. We tend to assume that a highly experienced pilot, 11,000 hours, a veteran of airliners and business jets alike, is essentially immune to catastrophic error. That experience builds a kind of armor against mistakes, and in many respects it does. Experience brings skill, judgment, pattern recognition, and calm. But fixation under cognitive saturation is not a skill deficit that experience can fill. It is a fundamental limitation of the human cognitive system, the finite capacity of attention and working memory, and that limitation exists in the expert and the novice alike. In fact, there is a subtle trap in which experience can even contribute. A very experienced pilot, confident in his ability to salvage a situation, may press on where a more cautious aviator might have broken off earlier, trusting that he can make it work. When the workload then spikes beyond what anyone could handle, the saturation sets in regardless of the thousands of hours in the logbook. The mind that becomes overwhelmed at Black Boucher was a skilled and experienced mind. That is exactly what makes the accident so sobering. It demonstrates that this failure mode is not something that happens only to the undertrained or the incompetent, but something woven into the architecture of human cognition itself, waiting for the conditions that can trigger it in anyone. There is a profound and troubling irony at the center of this accident, and it concerns the very warnings that were supposed to keep the aircraft safe. The collision avoidance system that alerted the pilot to the microlight, and the terrain awareness system that called pull up 6 times. These are safety systems. They exist to protect aircraft, to catch dangerous situations and prompt corrective action. In the vast majority of cases, they do exactly that, and they have saved countless lives. But at Black Bushy, these safety systems, firing in rapid succession at the worst possible moment, appear to have contributed to the very saturation that doomed the flight. Each warning was correct. There really was traffic. The aircraft really was descending dangerously, but each warning also consumed a slice of the pilot's finite attention, and together, arriving in a barrage during the most demanding phase of flight, they helped push his mental capacity past its limit. This is a deeply uncomfortable truth, that a safety system, working exactly as designed, can under certain circumstances add to a pilot's load rather than lightening it, and can become part of the cascade that overwhelms them. It does not mean the systems are bad, or that they should not exist. They save far more lives than they imperil. But it points to a real and difficult problem in the design of warnings, that alarms compete for the same limited attention they are trying to protect, and that a flood of alerts at a critical moment can, tragically, contribute to the loss of the very situational awareness they are meant to preserve. There is a further, smaller detail from the aftermath that deserves mention, both for completeness and because it was examined carefully. When the aircraft came to rest and caught fire, the airport's fire service responded, but their access to the crash site in the adjacent car park was hampered. The route led through a locked gate, and the first fire vehicles to arrive had to wait for another that carried the key. It is natural to wonder whether this delay cost lives. The investigation considered the question directly and concluded that, in this particular case, the delay did not change the outcome. The fire was of a nature and intensity that it would have continued until the fuel was consumed regardless, and the tragic reality is that the occupants could not have been saved once the fire took hold. The airfield nonetheless took sensible steps afterward, ensuring that every fire vehicle carried the necessary keys and improving its procedures, so that access would never be a question in some future emergency. It is a reminder that even when a particular failing does not change a specific outcome, it is still worth fixing, because the next accident may be different. But it is important to be clear that the locked gate did not cause these deaths. The fire did, and the fire was the consequence of an aircraft arriving at the ground with far more energy than it could safely dissipate. It is worth understanding, too, the vicious circle between an unstabilized approach and a saturated mind, because at Blackbush each fed the other. An aircraft carries energy in 2 forms, the energy of its speed and the energy of its height. To land, a pilot must shed both in a controlled way, arriving at the runway with just enough of each and no more. When an aircraft is too high and too fast, as the Phenom was after its maneuvering in the circuit, it has too much energy, and getting rid of excess energy quickly is one of the hardest things to do in an aircraft, which is designed to conserve energy, not dump it. So the high and fast pilot faces a mounting problem. The aircraft resists slowing down and coming down, the runway approaches, and the gap between where the aircraft is and where it needs to be refuses to close. This is itself a high workload situation, and here is the vicious circle. Because the high workload of wrestling an over-energized aircraft toward the runway is piled on top of everything else, adding to the very saturation that prevents the pilot from making the one decision, to go around. That would end the problem. The worse the energy state, the higher the workload. The higher the workload, the more saturated the mind. The more saturated the mind, the less able it is to choose the escape that would fix the energy state. Round and round it goes, tightening, until the aircraft crosses the threshold far too fast and the trap has closed. Breaking that circle requires stepping outside it, going around, and that is precisely what the saturated mind cannot bring itself to do. The lessons of Black Bushy are lessons about the mind, and they are among the most valuable in all of aviation, and indeed, beyond it. The first is the supreme importance of the go-around, and of the discipline of breaking off a bad approach early, before the workload has a chance to spike into saturation. The safest time to abandon a compromised approach is at the first sign that it is going wrong, while the mind is still clear and capable of making the decision. Once the situation has deteriorated and the warnings are cascading, and the tunnel has begun to narrow, the very capacity to choose the go-around may already be slipping away. This is why pilots are trained to set firm objective criteria for a stable approach, and to commit in advance to going around if those criteria are not met, because a decision made in advance by a calm mind can rescue a pilot whose mind is no longer calm. The go-around is not a maneuver of last resort. It is a maneuver best used early, as a defense against ever reaching the point of no return. The second lesson concerns the management of workload and attention, and the recognition that human mental capacity is finite and can be overwhelmed. Modern aviation increasingly acknowledges this, that pilots must be trained not just in the mechanics of flying, but in the management of their own cognitive resources, in recognizing the signs of overload, in shedding non-essential tasks when the load climbs, in prioritizing ruthlessly, and above all, in understanding that the feeling of being overwhelmed is itself a signal, one that should prompt a step back rather than a doubling down. It concerns, too, the design of the systems and warnings that surround the pilot, the sobering recognition that safety alerts, for all their value, draw on the same finite well of attention they are meant to protect, and that their design must reckon with the danger of overwhelming the very person they are trying to help. The barrage of warnings at Black Bushy was, in a sense, the safety system working, and also, tragically, part of what went wrong. Resolving that paradox, designing warnings that inform without saturating, remains one of the ongoing challenges of aviation human factors engineering. And there is a final lesson, broader than aviation, that gives this accident its enduring resonance. Fixation under overload is not unique to pilots. It is a universal feature of the human mind, and it appears wherever people must make decisions under pressure, with too much happening at once. In operating rooms and control rooms, on trading floors and battlefields, in any high-stakes environment where the demands can outstrip the mind's capacity to meet them. The surgeon who fixates on one problem while another goes unnoticed. The driver who locks onto a hazard and steers straight into it. The operator who, overwhelmed by cascading alarms, misses the one that matters. All are experiencing versions of what happened in that cockpit over Black Bushy. The accident is a window into a fundamental vulnerability of human cognition, and its lesson is one everyone can take to heart. That when we feel the tunnel beginning to narrow, when the demands are piling up faster than we can meet them, the most important thing we can do is precisely what is hardest in that moment: to step back, to widen our view, to remember that there is almost always a way out, and that the option to stop and start over has not, in fact, disappeared. It only feels as though it has. 4 people boarded a small jet in Milan on a summer afternoon and died a short time later in a fire beside a runway in England, at the end of an approach that should never have been continued, flown by a capable pilot whose mind, overwhelmed in the final minutes, could no longer find the way out, There was no storm, no broken machine, no failure of skill in the ordinary sense. There was only a good pilot, too much at once, and a tunnel that narrowed until the only thing left in view was a runway he could not stop on. It is a disaster that offers no villain to blame and no simple fix to point to. Only a hard, humbling truth about the limits of the human mind, and the vital importance of the disciplines, the training, and the humility that help us guard against those limits. The go-around he never made was available to the very end. The tragedy of Blackbush is that, in his saturated and fixated state, he could no longer see it, and 4 people paid the price for a failure not of character, but of a mind pushed past what any mind can bear.